All right, in this section, I want to talk a bit about what aggregate data are. First of all, I use data as plural, and one individual data point would be a datum. But aggregate data are data on groups. They could be a whole bunch of different groups that we'd apply, both people as well as institutions and organizations. I think it's useful to think about two different types of aggregate data. There's summary indicators of individual phenomena. So this is often discrete. Can a person read? Yes or no. How old is a particular individual? Are they 23? Are they 14? Are they 85? These are specific point values or dichotomous variables for a 0 or 1. Are they in a particular summary group? Are they in a demographic group? Are they in socioeconomic group? What career are they in? This is information about an individual. Then there's also ways to try to have summary indicators about individuals, but that are summarized to the group, and these are often percentages. So instead of just does a person read, if you're looking at the individual level, at the group level, it would be the percentage of a population that can read, the percentage of people that are foreign born, the percentage of population that are dentists or that are unemployed. These things are percentages, which are summary indicators about a group of individuals. Then there's another measure. I don't expect you to know or remember this term, senality, but it is just a measure of the group itself. It's not a summary indicator of individual measures, like whether you can read or not, percentage that people can read or not, but it's about the group itself. Is the group institution a democracy or a non-democracy? Is a group of people at war or not at war? That is not a characteristic of the individual, it's a characteristic of the group. So there's these two types of data, one in which it's a summary indicator of bottom-up individual characteristics, and the other one is just a measure of the state itself, right? So is it in a particular region? You can think of a whole bunch of different examples of that. Another couple ways of thinking about aggregate data, one in which is the group or is that group that you're looking at a function of geography? Is it the number of people that are in the ACT or in a particular country or in a village? These people are defined by their location, or you could also have people defined by those kind of demographic groups that I was talking about earlier, that are defined by personal characteristics. So when you think about your aggregate data and your argument, are you thinking about the group as a group, or are you thinking about the group as having a summary indications of personal individual indicators? They can help us measure latent, unobservable phenomena. As I mentioned earlier, that a lot of what we care about and a lot of what we look at in political science are fundamentally unobservable phenomenon. Is a country truly a democracy? Do people really have free political communication? Is a state global or open to the rest of the world or not? Are the people by and large healthy or not? You can come up with different proxies or different facets of the larger outcome that you're really interested in, whether it's the number of people with TVs, cell phones, internet connections, as you can see with protests in recent days, have governments have increasingly cracked down by trying to reduce political communication. The march towards globalization in the last couple of years because of the pandemic has taken a beating. Health as well. How much can we think about latent, unobservable general factors like democracy, development, health, these kind of things? What specific, concrete part of that can we analyze, both theoretically as well as empirically? Where can we actually find these data on these proxies for the concepts that we actually care about? I can think of a lot of Examples, I've met with students in thinking about their revised problem statement as well as with their final essays. These are the types of starting points that I usually point students towards. So I thought putting in a video might be helpful. Censuses. Australia, we have a census run by the Australian Bureau of Statistics every 5 years, but almost every country has a census. Some in times of war aren't able to run them, but they're often a good source of information about the individuals within that country. Or if you're interested in going subnational, like the Lijphart reading was talking about for this week, that you can often find it easier to compare and to hold that other things constant with that ceteris paribus assumption by looking within a country. So you can look at census data to look at personal characteristics or group characteristics at the city or village or state level using censuses. India has a great census, the US, other countries as well that are often in English. And then the next source would be international organizations or non-governmental organizations. The World Bank's indicators, World Development Indicators, are now available online, and I've used their data in lectures before, but I would encourage you there. There's a lot of characteristics about states, economic development, personal health, the Sustainable Development Goals, etc. IMF also has data more so related to trade and aid. European Union has data on those specific countries. Other regional organizations have data capacity as well. UNESCO, other organs of the United Nations have reports and data on the area that they work on. When I conduct human trafficking research, the UN's Office on Drugs and Crime has some great data on illicit activity. So whatever topic you're interested in, if it's within a country, you might want to look at a census. World Bank holds demographic surveys and business surveys within countries. So organizations can also have within country analysis. But if you're looking cross-nationally, organizational data might be the next way of going. We talked about surveys in week 5. They're a popular way at trying to understand political behavior and political beliefs. There's a whole bunch of different surveys, as I mentioned before, from the World Bank and other international organizations. There's Asia Barometer, Afro Barometer, Latino Barometer, looking at people's individual experiences and beliefs in particular regions. I found them really useful for people's own perspectives on being exposed to election violence and threats of violence. The Australian Election Survey, which we run in our department here at the ANU, is useful for people's and voters' beliefs within Australia. World Values Survey and Gallup look at surveys in a comparative framework. There's a whole bunch of different surveys that are really useful and interesting online. Other sources of aggregate data would be publications, newspapers, books. Some companies like Keysings, LexisNexis, Factiva have systematic informational gathering and publications about different political activities and outcomes and meetings that could also be potentially useful. Those often turn into event data for, I know event data mostly having to do with conflict, international or domestic conflict. ACLID has gathered data on protests related to the coronavirus pandemic. They've gathered really interesting data on the January 6th protests in the United States. The UCDP is one of the largest data sources on civil conflict and internationalized civil conflict. So SCAD looks at Africa and Latin America for social conflict. There's a lot of different event data sets. Happy to give you advice if you have any questions about those. The last category I think would be useful to think about are expert data. I've discussed the varieties of democracy data in previous weeks. I used to manage the election integrity project. We also surveyed election experts to try to reach judgments about election integrity. So there's other projects that do something similar. So these are just different measures, from just counting beans, or counting how old people are, counting basic informational facts about individuals with censuses, all the way to experts, sample surveys, country level measures. There's a whole bunch of different options for looking at aggregate data. Now I'd like to switch to different ways of trying to analyze those data, going from the gold standard of running an experiment all the way through observational comparative statistics, using a couple of examples. And an experiment, something that people have taken, it's the distillation of the scientific method that we've talked about ever since week one, in which you have randomization. You have a random sample. You break out people into two different groups that are representative. They're ceteris paribus, they're equal on all other factors except for this one treatment that they give. In this article that I came across in the Journal of Experimental Political Science, there is a journal that just focuses on experiments. There's experiments do get published in other places. There's EGAP and other initiatives to try to encourage people to run more experiments. But I thought this one was interesting. It won a prize last year looking at linguistic and religious assimilation in Germany. And they ran an absolutely huge experiment in which they had people dropping on a phone, speaking in either in German or foreign language, wearing hijab or not, and then dropping fruit and trying to analyze whether native Germans would help them try to pick it up or not, to try to look at whether people were discriminating against immigrants for the religious affiliation or the linguistic affiliation. And they basically found here that it was the overt display of religious affiliated garments that led to the statistically significant decrease in offers of assistance. With these kind of experiments, you don't need to run regressions because there really is only one factor that's different across these two different groups, the treatment that you impose. And so that's why you can run simple statistics that you've already learned last week. So you have these columns here, the assistance rates, so that would be that aggregate measure of the group in these three different groups. Immigrants who wore the hijab and spoke the German language, no hijab and spoke the German language, and then the German language. And you can see the p-values are statistically significant. It's below 0.1 between column 1 and column 2. And those little sideways H's, or those I's there, are the confidence intervals around those estimates. So this is an experiment, something that, as I said back in week one, because of the ethics considerations of getting approval for experiments before you can run them, it's not something that students are going to do for this class, but that it is that kind of gold standard for only having one factor that differentiates the groups, and then you can see to what extent there is changes that are statistically significant or not. The next level of being able to make causal inferences about your conclusions from your study is a natural experiment. And I think the Posner article for this week is just so cool. And Posner has a whole other article about how you can use borders in African countries as a source for natural experimentation. But Robert Putnam also had a famous one as well, showed this these two maps of Italy in the first slide. And he's making an argument about how the civic community and the civic spirit in different parts of Italy are systematically different from each other, that dates back almost 1,000 years, and that has a direct effect on institutional performance in the 1990s. And he leveraged what he said was a natural experiment for this difference in civic spirit between the northern and southern parts of the country. And so you have you think the pandemic would be a great natural experiment for how some exogenous factor changed two different groups, in one that did have the treatment and one not, and you can try to make arguments about what that effect is. For the Posner article, we're going to be talking more about that in the tutorial. but the whole takeaway was that administrative boundaries in colonial Africa were determined not by any characteristics of the people on the ground, but just as an instrument of control. And so they split people who had been otherwise identical before the split, like in Zambia and Malawi in this case. And so he looked at 4 different villages that were as close and as comparable to each other across the borders. This natural experiment would be the border separating these people, and looking at how the relations between these two ethnic groups and their political salience was really dramatically different in Zimbabwe and Malawi. And the argument is because everything else is equal, the language that they speak, the colonial education that they have, he runs through a whole list of other potential confounding effects and says and explains why they're not relevant. That is just because these groups were large enough as a percentage of the population in Malawi to be a source of coalition building for elections. Those ethnicities were seen as salient in Malawi, while in Zambia they were a much smaller percentage of the population, were seen as largely as I believe Easterners, that they weren't seen as politically salient, which is why you can see these huge differences in the survey responses between the different groups, again with the y-axis as the percentage aggregate response of individual beliefs, that they would not vote for a presidential candidate from the other group in Malawi, that they would not marry a person from the other group, and that it's frowned upon, that there is this huge difference. They didn't show, Posner doesn't show those confidence intervals or the statistical significance tests in this graph, like the graph that I showed you in the previous slide, because these differences are so dramatic, and he mentions in the text that they are statistically significant. But it does show with the natural experiment, if you can find them, and people have in the review process tried to poke holes in what would be considered a natural experiment. But if you are lucky enough to find one, then you really can make some conclusions about causality in your evidence, that it is no other exogenous factor. Everything is ceteris paribus, that it really is just that one factor, the size of the coalitions in this case, that drives the salience of ethnicity in their countries. Moving on down the scale of direct strength of belief that we can have about the causal relation between our theory and our evidence would be a comparative case study. We started back in week 1 with a single case study of the Balinese cockfights. Comparative case studies. The second reading for this week is the Jared Diamond's chapter on the difference of environment, level of development, and stability between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. I really thought this case was interesting. You can look at satellite photos of the two parts of one island and show how dramatic environmental differences, level of political stability that we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years. And that first segment of the Diamond chapter really does show how this comparison, holding the ceteris paribus, the theoretically the environment was comparable, though he did say because the rains in the mountains, it did have different levels of rainfall and agricultural productivity. But I think he makes a compelling argument about how in the early days Haiti was more agriculturally productive than the Dominican Republic side was, because of the language difference and the openness to foreigners and trade. Are those crucial explanations that Diamond was suggesting, helped explain the different levels of relative economic development between those two parts of the border. So there, it's not necessarily a natural experiment, but it is trying to hold as much the same as possible. Geography, in some ways colonial history, at least the initial colonial history, to help explain why conflicts break out in some parts of the world and not others. Connecting back to the Posner, there's far more cultural cleavages in the world than there are conflicts. So what is it that makes these cleavages salient. And you can make different arguments about whether it's historical, political leaders, economic, environmental, all those different kind of factors through those comparative case studies. By selecting creative pairs of states, you can make some statements that might be less directly comparable than with a natural experiment or regular experiment, but it's still one that you want to try to hold as much the same as possible. The most frequent category that we're going to be looking at in this class are just comparative statistics, aggregate comparative statistics to be specific, and that is statistics on individuals aggregated to the group level, or individual surveys when people's results are compared against each other. I thought of an example from a recent paper that I published with a co-author, and this paper, I think I went a little bit overboard in trying to show the descriptive statistics as well as the correlational statistics. We've actually gotten cited a whole bunch of, this is actually having an impact, so I think people's ability to be able to understand things did help their likelihood of actually citing it. But in comparative statistics, I started with descriptive statistics of the dependent variable, which is how much election integrity experts thought an election had in that figure 1. And then we had 4 main independent variables with hypothesis for each. And I did histograms for each one of those different variables. These are ideas that I would encourage you to think about using for your own essays to show that you understand what your variable is, how it's distributed, and what the range is, what the most common category is. You can learn a lot just by visualizing them through these kind of histograms. I also had summary statistics tables. So we had an hypothesis 1 through 4 for each one of these different factors. Posner didn't have an observable hypothesis. I would encourage you to have them for your final papers. I even included a list of every single country and their score on the dependent variable. Because these data were so new and they hadn't really been seen before, that's when you want to spend more time describing basic characteristics about them. If you're doing summary statistics for your papers, I would encourage you to do so because you want to show that you have the basic skills to be able to conduct summary statistics. But often in published research, if you are just showing GDP, you don't really need to do a histogram for those unless you want to try to transform them to show why you might want to do that. Our comparative statistical analysis, we had data at a couple of different levels. These aggregate levels were at the election, characteristic of the election. Those were the main things we cared about theoretically, whether the laws favored the incumbents, whether they had fair media access, everyone who was contesting the election, whether voters were threatened with violence. That's kind of my thing, so I wanted to make sure I included that. And whether the election authorities, the EMBs that I mentioned earlier, were impartial. And we had results. So kind of like with the correlation, you want to look at the direction and significance. So you can see here, as laws favor the incumbents, that decreased the election integrity. You have a negative sign there, and the 3 stars shows that it's statistically significant at the 0.01 level. More fair media access, increased perceived election integrity. More violence or threatened violence, decreased election integrity. You can tell that by the negative coefficient, and the three stars suggest that it's statistically significant, and the impartiality also increased the perceived integrity. So you can go through and so you have state level, individual level, as a way to try to include all the potential explanations for the specific scores. The last kind of technique for comparative statistics I wanted to highlight, I don't expect you to be able to do this, but I think it really connects well to the natural experiment readings, like the Posner reading for this week, in which you get kind of a pseudo-natural experiment through matching. And I think we're going to get some matching readings later on, maybe not in this term, but it's a way to try to, from just general observational data, to be able to conduct a pseudo experiment or a pseudo natural experiment by trying to match different pairs of observations we have in our data that are similar in as many dimensions as possible, except for a treatment. So, given the previous example for election integrity, we would try to match different elections across all those different characteristics I had in that previous slide, except for whether an election was observed by international monitors. And then we run a regression on those matched observations to see whether election observation had an independent effect. So you have a more balanced sample of observations that are almost identical. So you say, and this can be really random, you can have a country observation of one country that's in one year and another country in another year, but because there are similarities across, let's say, population or GDP or other variables, they're similar except on that one variable. And matching is a way that's becoming increasingly relevant in recent years as a way to kind of do that pseudo-natural experiment, but with aggregate data. So a couple of important takeaways, I think, from this section. It's the aggregate data are data on either individuals within the group or the group itself. These groups can be grouped by physical area or demographic characteristics. This helps us kind of capture proxies of those unmeasurable latent outcomes that we often focus on in our theories. And there's a lot of different ways to compare groups. I focused on four: experiment, natural experiment, comparative case study, and comparative statistics, whether of a survey or of national level, group level characteristics. So I think those are ways to try to think, hopefully theoretically, about the theory of groups as well as how the measures that we have of those groups can be used in our analysis of just one factor or two factors like we did in correlations for last week, or multiple factors that we're going to learn about in weeks 11 and week 12. So with that, let's move on to some of the challenges in using these kind of data.